Hi, my name is Miyoko Chu. I'm the Senior Director of Communications at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And I want to thank those of you in the room who are here tonight despite a tornado watch. And thanks to those of you who are keeping cozy at home, whether you're in the Ithaca region or halfway around the world, to join us by live stream tonight. I also want to thank those of you who are members and donors of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. You support our mission to improve the understanding and protection of birds, including events like this with Christine Sheppard tonight from the American Bird Conservancy. Your generosity makes our work possible, so thank you. I also wanted to let you know that our next seminar will be on June 5th with videographer and film producer Anne Prum. That's June 5th. So I first connected with Christine about coming to give this talk after two of our fledglings. Hold on, did I just advance a slide? Should I go back one? Or is this the first
That's
one?
fine.
Okay, sorry, I accidentally advanced a slide so you have a preview. So I connected with Christine about coming to give this talk after two of our fledgling hawks collided with windows on campus last year. The hawks that are featured on our bird cams. One of them hit a window at Mann Library, and about a week later, its sibling hit a bus shelter, leaving an imprint on the window that I think was very haunting. The collision injured its spine and paralyzed it so that it had to be euthanized. And I think all of us who know these hawks really felt the agony of that, but it's amazing how common such collisions are. Charles Eldermeyer, the BirdCam's project leader, went to campus to look at the glass where those birds had hit, and on the day that he went, he found an ovenbird on the ground near the same area where one of the hawks had collided. And I think most of us can relate to having probably seen a bird either hit glass or found one on the ground. We know that hundreds of millions of birds suffer a fate like this from colliding with windows every year in the United States alone. And that kind of number is almost impossible to comprehend. Fortunately, there are actions that all of us can take, and that's why Christine is here tonight to be able to tell us about some solutions and why they work. And I also want to mention that Wild Birds Unlimited has this publication available for sale from the American Bird Conservancy and New York City Audubon called Bird-Friendly Building Design. So if you're interested in this topic, I'd suggest that you purchase a copy and also support Chris's project. So Chris received her PhD here at Cornell University in ecology and evolutionary biology, and she spent most of her career at the Bronx Zoo as the curator of birds. And after that, she joined the American Bird Conservancy as their bird collisions campaign manager. And in that role, she worked to reduce bird mortality from collisions with glass through education and outreach to architects and to building managers, through advocacy to government decision makers and industry, and through research and strategic partnership with other conservation organizations, including the Lab of Ornithology. So welcome, Christine.
Thank you very much. So it's good to be back in Ithaca. So this is the problem. People are actually often ask if we have video of birds hitting walls or glass, and we don't usually. This is an unusual situation where a bird that had been rehabbed was being released, and they didn't think that it would be a bad idea to release it near a big reflective glass wall.
Christine, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh.
Do you mind going back and showing that video one more time?
Sure.
Just go back one more. Thank you.
So a lot of people were very excited, and that's why there was video of this bird. But this is something that happens much too frequently. Luckily, there's a lot we can do about it. We actually know how to fix this. We just have to get people to do it. And I'm the only person in the world with a full-time job that is basically just doing something about bird collisions. I was at the Bronx Zoo for 30 years. I was a student of Tom Cade's at Cornell, and I got interested in captive breeding of endangered species and reintroducing them, and that's what took me down to the zoo. And as you can see, if you look at some of these photographs, the Bronx Zoo, like many old zoos, has a lot of buildings that don't have a lot of glass in them. So I was not particularly aware of the collisions problem that I'm now trying to address, but we had a lot of glass-fronted exhibits. We had to work with birds that had to live in proximity to glass. So if you look at that shot in the top right, what we know is that birds can learn to recognize individual pieces of glass. If you soap up the glass like we did there, you put a bird in there, after 3 days you can take the soap off, and the bird most of the time knows that the glass is there. Now, the bottom right photograph is what happens in circumstances where it's likely that birds are going to forget. In a space that big, if another bird is chasing you, you're not looking where you're going, you could easily slam into a piece of glass. Interestingly, what we came up with to do on that handrail in 1982 is still something that we might recommend doing today. It's not very attractive, though, so one of the things I'm trying to do is come up with more attractive ways to save birds. So I was at the Bronx Zoo for a long time, and in about 2007, we started to design a new building. This was going to be the Center for Global Conservation. It wasn't an animal exhibit. It was basically an office building, but we wanted it to be a sustainable building. We wanted it to be bird friendly. And this was how I originally got involved in bird collisions in the first place, was being part of this process of designing this building. We were working with an architect, Bruce Fowle, who was married to the executive director of New York City Audubon, Marcia Fowle. And they had recently published a document called Bird Safe Building Guidelines. So they really had the last word, and we wanted to incorporate everything that we could, all of those recommendations, into this building. And we did. I left the Bronx Zoo right at the time that we opened that building, but I telecommute from home, and WCS was kind enough to host me in this building. I have a desk behind one of these windows. And I also continued running the monitoring program for this building. And we were able to keep doing that for about 3 years until the peafowl discovered that they could come and snatch some of the birds that actually hit the building. But we've remediated the glass that was causing that. So the last laugh is on us, not those peafowl. Anyway, so this is the Center for Global Conservation. Behind that cement wall, there's a meadow. It's designed so that water that runs off the roof doesn't overflow the storm drains and so forth. It's one of the requirements for sustainable design. That sort of diagonal thing you see there it's a green overhang. It's not really a green roof because it's not over a room, but it looks like this from the outside. So we put louvers on the glass adjacent to the green roof. That is a recommendation. Birds are attracted to green roofs. There's a lot of interesting work going on in New York City because New York City started putting green roofs in large numbers. And they're old enough now that we're actually able to see that they can help support birds that are migrating through with stopover sites with food, insects, and things like that. So you can see that they did not put a glass handrail on this, which would have been a really bad idea for birds. We have gotten some collisions on these louvered windows. I think the louvers maybe should have been a little bit closer together. But in general, that's a strategy that's worked quite well for this building. This was a corner conference room. We spec'd a special glass that came from Germany called Ornolux. You can see that it's got a striped pattern on it. Those stripes are actually quite reflective in the UV, which many birds can see a lot better than we can. So the pattern is bolder if you're a bird, or if you're many birds. And it's the only part of that building that's never been documented to kill a bird. So, unfortunately, this building got if you know what a LEED rating is, it got a LEED Gold rating, and it got an innovation credit for making 50% of the glass bird friendly. And that was really kind of one of the first questions, is 50% enough? Probably not. But most of that 50% was for using light colored shades. And as we started to monitor this building, we really started to discover that many of these standard recommendations didn't work at all. And certainly, if you look at these light colored shades, you can see that when the shades are visible, you can still see a strong reflection. The reflection can be strong enough that you cannot see behind it. And this is really one of the basic lessons of how to stop collisions. You have to do something with the outside surface, because if reflections are the problem, the reflections can basically obliterate the sight of anything that you do on the inside of the building, which makes it all a bit more difficult, unfortunately. I mean, this is transparent glass. This is not a mirror glass. But it's extremely reflective, and it has now been remediated, I'm happy to say. So at this point, this is a pretty bird-friendly building. This was a problem that we discovered. It wasn't related to a recommendation, but we discovered that there's a lake behind this building. Birds would fly out of this field and somehow be channeled by that rocky outcrop into the front door, which had the highest rate of collisions of any piece of glass. We actually had 3 mallards hit that door once. Very reflective. Again, now it's been remediated, but you can see that kind of design often. Birds will very frequently follow paths that are intended for humans, because it's much easier if you don't have to fly around a bunch of obstacles. Unfortunately, lots of paths made for humans end in glass doors and glass walls. You'll often see, 2 wings of a building with a connector, and that can actually act like a funnel. Birds will follow along the walls and then hit the glass of the connector. That's something that, when you recognize it, you can often do something about. You can change the landscaping or fix the door. Overhangs. This is another very typical recommendation, and unfortunately it doesn't work at all. These are very deep overhangs. They're much deeper than you would ordinarily get on a building, and as you can see, there are very strong reflections on that glass there. It might protect birds flying overhead from seeing the glass, but it's definitely not going to protect birds that are in those trees from trying to fly to the reflections of those trees. So there a lot of general recommendations that, at least in many specifics, don't work, that may not work at all. And overhangs is definitely one of the ones that I would not recommend doing. Another, and this is a non sequitur, but recommendation that you frequently see on websites, even now, is to use angled glass. And even the guy that actually came up with that recommendation no longer supports it. He'd done a study, and it was in a very particular place. He had birds flying off a bird feeder towards this glass, so they were always hitting at an acute angle, which means there was a lot less energy. The glass itself actually reflected the ground, and the ground was all sort of gravel and dirt. So he thought that because this glass reflected the ground, it was safer. Whereas in fact it probably had to do with the fact that the birds were flying parallel off the bird feeder. They couldn't fly perpendicularly into the glass, or they didn't, which is what would be the most damaging. And even the fact that when you tilt glass, you have to use more of it to cover the same vertical distance. Anyway, but this is the New York Times printing plant. It's a 2-story curtain wall of angled glass, and the reflection of that garden is something that any bird might want to fly into. And you can see that thing about a quarter mile away. It's really, really vivid, and anybody that sees there immediately is like, oh, forget angled glass. So there were a lot of recommendations that really turned out not to be useful. Fritted glass is a different kind of example. There's Dr. Dan Clem from Muhlenberg College has been working on collisions for years and years and years. He is basically my age and started his doctoral work on collisions. He worked with Swarthmore College 10 or 15 years ago because they had developed a science building and the windows were killing lots of birds. His solution was what we call fritted glass, but it was an unusual form of fritted glass. Frits are small ceramic dots that are applied as part of the glass making process. They're used to reduce heat gain. They're little sunshades, and usually they can be any size, but a lot of it is almost invisible to the human eye. So he put a very solid white coating of frit on those windows. But unfortunately, the recommendation that came out of this was to use fritted glass, not specifying what kind of fritted glass is actually going to work. So in a number of cases, I've seen people that have used fritted glass with a frit pattern that was essentially invisible. But they thought because it was fritted glass that somehow it would deter bird collisions. So it turned out that most of the recommendations back when I was starting to do this in 2008, 2009, really wasn't based on much or involved some level of misunderstanding of what actually was working and what was actually being recommended. So this, I've spent a long time in the airport in Detroit, and these are different views of the same window, but on the left, if you're standing across the concourse, you can't see that there's frit in those windows. As you get closer, you can see that there are dots, but you have to be very close. And the bad news is that there are no solutions that will deter bird collisions that really aren't visible to people. I think it's worth it, that you should have something on your windows that saves birds. And part of my job is to convince other people that that's the case. So the other thing that happened, the other reason that I started really figuring out what was going on, I was asked to join the Bird Safe Glass Foundation, and New York City Audubon, which is a chapter that we work with a lot, had created these bird safe building guidelines, and they had planned to take it national. They were going to have people in other cities replace some of the examples with their own photographs and make their own versions of this. And New York City Audubon's board decided that their mission was New York City and they didn't want to be expanding. So New York City Audubon asked ABC if we would take over this project. And in the process of doing the first revision, I really did discover that most of these recommendations that were being made at the time were educated guesses, old wives' tales, misunderstanding of scientific reports. So when we did the first revision, which is down at the bottom left, we made a lot of really significant changes. And New York City Audubon continued to be our partner and didn't yell at us for doing that. You can see that we still use the green barcodes at the top in that second edition, so that represents New York City Audubon. And in the third one, we basically carried over that green color, but we still have their logo on the front cover. And they're wonderful people. I work with them all the time. But the goal with that publication is to really synthesize everything that's known in the scientific literature and in the architectural literature and elsewhere. So this is a table of comparative mortality. It's hard to know how many birds are killed by bird collisions because it happens in so many places. But in 2012, the Smithsonian decided that they wanted to hire somebody who would use the modern statistical techniques and would gather as much data as they could find out there and put it together to come up with a reasonably science-based estimate of how many birds were being killed. Now, interestingly, back in 1990, Dan Clem, the man I mentioned, had done a back-of-the-envelope calculation. He estimated that every house probably kills 1 to 10 birds. He multiplied that by the number of homes in the census, and he came out with 100 million to 1 billion. So we're still looking at estimates of mortality that are in the range of 1 billion. Unfortunately, I mean, this estimate was based on data that's probably 10 years old at least now. So glass is being put into the environment more or less continually, and we're almost certainly closer to that 1 billion level than we are to 300 million. And something that we've been finding out lately, as people have been studying people who are studying bird collisions, is that even dedicated monitors may find as little as 40% of the total number of carcasses in an area. So most of these numbers are underestimates. So yeah, it's actually pretty depressing. But the positive thing is that we actually, as opposed to many conservation issues, have something that we can directly do at home to fix this. One of the first things that you should do is, if you have a cat, you should keep it inside. You can see there that cats actually may kill more birds than buildings, but it's not a competition. So, and you know, you can make a bird-friendly building that doesn't look like a bunker. So this is the new Intuit headquarters building in Mountain View. Mountain View is one of a group of cities in California that mandates bird-friendly design. But this is bird-friendly glass that complies with that. It really provides, you know, the transparency of what you want with glass, with a signal that will deter birds. The building hasn't been up long enough for us to get much data on it, but people have reported birds swerving. So we hope that they keep doing that. But one of the reasons that people are reluctant to address bird collision problems is that they're afraid that we're going to tell them to use brick walls and no glass. And that's really not true. Although you can use a brick wall if you want. So early documentation, or most of the documentation of bird collisions, has been done in cities where people were aware of a collision problem, and usually volunteers who are bird lovers want to document both the fact that there's a problem and they want to rescue the birds that aren't dead yet, the injured birds. They're not scientists. There's a considerably more science around collisions with wind turbines, with cell towers, because you know where they all are. You can find them on a map. You can actually do a study. It's very difficult to do that because any piece of glass that's in the vicinity of a bird can be dangerous. So you obviously can't study every building in a city. But there have been a lot of programs around the country that have really been dedicated to showing that this is a significant issue. And ABC started working on this in about 2008. We were able to get the city of San Francisco to pass an ordinance requiring bird-friendly design. They did that in 2011. And it's very important if you can get, you know, one example other people are likely to follow. And what we've seen in California is that Oakland passed a similar but more stringent law. And then as you went around San Francisco Bay, you got to Mountain View, where they had a considerably more stringent law than San Francisco. And now San Francisco is getting ready to revise theirs to make it stricter again. So what we're seeing across the country is that many places are actually mandating bird-friendly design. And people are saying that it's a requirement that doesn't cause you to have to build ugly buildings, you know, that you can't see out of. So the longer this goes on, the more momentum we hope we get. So why do birds hit glass? I mean, I've read a lot of things that said, why are these birds so stupid? Why are they hitting glass? And the fact is, I mean, birds see the world very literally. You could fly, but if you weren't paying attention, you could walk into those reflections too. It's not that birds are unintelligent. They just don't understand the concept of glass. They often will try to fly to something on the other side of a piece of glass. So this is the Ford Foundation atrium in New York City. And there are more trees in that atrium than there are for several blocks on either side. So if you're a bird and you come down after a migratory flight and the sun comes up and you're looking for greenery, because that means insects, you're going to fly right into that atrium window. It was just weird that they were washing the windows the day I went down to take that photograph. We have started doing some real studies, and not surprisingly, those studies have shown that the more glass you have on a building, the more collisions you're going to get. And that goes for both proportionately and absolutely. So these Apple buildings, may be very trendy, but they're not particularly good for birds. I actually give a lot of classes to architects, and I got to use this slide with the architects that designed that glass box. And they noticed. Birds hit buildings all year round, but the most frequent collision victims are night flying migrants. But most collisions take place during the day. Birds are not hitting buildings at night. Or I've met at least one person who has seen birds perching in a tree and then flying into a building at night, but the majority of collisions happen after the sun comes up. People often ask if there's a billion dead birds out there, why aren't the streets paved with them? Why are we not seeing carcasses all over the place? And there are a number of pretty obvious reasons for that. One is scavengers. So there are lots and lots of critters out there, starting with outdoor cats, raccoons, crows, opossums, skunks. They all love a nice little protein package, like this hooded warbler. A lot of times birds don't die directly below the window. A lot of birds are injured internally, and it may take a couple of days before they die somewhere else. So even if they fly off, they haven't necessarily survived. And they can also bounce off a window into plantings and things like that where they're not obvious. But the scavengers are the primary reason, and people who have studied scavengers have discovered that in some cases scavengers actually know of windows that cause lots of collisions, and the scavengers have that on their route. They check that window a couple times a day. Because of the connection with migratory birds, people often suspect that north and south facing building facades are more dangerous, and this turns out not to be true. The collisions are happening after the birds have become active during the day, and they're flying on all sides of these buildings. What they have found is there's a strong correlation between windows that reflect vegetation and more collisions. And that makes sense. The windows that reflect vegetation are in the activity zone of birds, which is in the area of vegetation. So from the ground up to the tree canopy, that tends to be where you see the most collisions. And it makes sense. Birds are in the vegetation. They try to fly to the reflected vegetation. But when people have been able to get up onto setbacks and rooftops, even on very tall buildings, they've found dead birds everywhere. So it's not that higher up glass doesn't kill birds, it simply kills fewer. And if one of the things you're doing is trying to identify priority areas for remediation, that's something to think about. If you're trying to get someone to fix a building and you say you must do something to every piece of glass that you have, they're just going to flip out and not talk to you. So if you can say, look, we know you've got 200,000 square feet of glass, but this 50,000 square feet is really the important stuff, you've got the beginnings of a dialogue. So that's one of the reasons that this kind of information is good to have. It helps a bit to know how birds see the world. We all know that birds don't see the way we do, but I've been trying to work my way into bird brains now for a long time. And you really don't realize how different the world is to them. People have flat faces. Primates have flat faces, and you've got eyes that are close together, mine more than some. And we have very good 3D vision. We have good depth perception. Birds don't see the same thing with each eye. Their eyes, in general, are on the sides of their heads. They see very different, I mean, just try to imagine what it's like with each eye seeing something else. They have very little depth perception. What they do have tends to be focused around the length of their bill, so they can figure out if they want to eat that or feed it to a chick or stick it into a nest. So they process the world more as something they're immersed in, whereas we have a tendency to see the world as something we're moving into. It's like there's a drive-in movie that we're sort of going into. So their perception is very different. Their most acute vision tends to be lateral out to the side, and they have different ways of figuring out how fast they're going and when they're going to get someplace. And this has a lot of relevance to collisions because they're not looking in front of them. To us, what's in front of us is almost always the most important thing. They are looking for predators behind them. They're looking around. If they're not flying in a cluttered environment, they may not be paying attention directly ahead at all. And there's been some very, very interesting work on exactly how birds navigate through cluttered environments. There are other differences. Birds see many more colors than we do. Again, I'd love to be able to see what a bird sees. They can see a wider range of colors as well as many different shades that we can't see. Some birds can see into the ultraviolet, not all of them. We've recently discovered that the distribution of UV vision amongst the birds is a lot more complicated than we at one point had thought. It's a single locus mutation that apparently goes back and forth. So there are a lot of birds that hit windows that don't see ultraviolet. And for a long, long time, people thought that the best solution for collisions was technology. We'd come up with UV signals that we could put on glass, and this would make birds avoid the glass. I mean, if you think about it, there's not a lot of UV around in the early morning when birds are active anyway. And on an overcast day like today, if the UV index is low, you're going to have less effectiveness, with a UV glass. So again, it's not the invisible. There is no invisible panacea. If we want to save birds, we have to decide that we're willing to do something. We're willing to see something, and not have birds collide with our windows. Birds can sense the magnetic field and use it for orientation, and I could do a whole different talk on birds and light and magnetism, but not today. It turns out that birds have poorer contrast sensitivity than humans. Contrast sensitivity is a bit difficult to explain, but it relates to how hard it is to tell two things apart at a distance. And birds have to be closer than we do to tell two things apart. This means, again, that if you want to make a signal that's going to stop a bird from flying into your window, it's hard to make it unnoticeable to humans. If people can't see it, birds can't see it either. So people in general think that they can see glass. They don't realize that they've learned about the concept of glass. I don't know how many of you took Introduction to Psychology, but there was a study called the visual cliff, where they put a big piece of glass on a tabletop and they had babies crawl on it. And babies would get to the edge and they're like, I'm not going out on that thing, there's nothing there. When you're born, you can't see glass. You don't know what it is. But you learn. You don't bump into it flying 30 miles an hour the way a bird might. And people are injured by glass all the time. You can see these people in the video. For people, you can put a line of decals on a piece of glass like that, and people will know that means that that's a glass wall. I have a very nice video of Justin Bieber running into a revolving door, which I wish I'd included here. But glass just isn't there. And if I show you this, if I take away the cues that tell you that glass is there, you cannot tell me if this is a picture of a tree, if this is a tree shot through a clear window or if this is a reflection of a tree, unless you're somebody who was here at lunch, in which case you know the answer. You literally can't tell reflection from reality. When you do that, you know that there's glass. So you can see there's a crack in one of those panes, there's some mullions, but you still don't know if it's reflection or see-through. It's only when you see this, the building across from the place I take my car for service, that you realize that this is a reflection. Birds don't understand those cues. Right angles, they don't see as unnatural. The things that tell us that glass is there are mysterious to birds. So while they can learn about individual panes of glass, I have a friend at the Baltimore Aquarium who reports there are birds that land on the edge of a canopy and they walk to the base of a glass wall to eat the insects that are slamming into the glass. So they can learn that, but they can't learn about glass as a concept. And this is one reason that migratory birds are so vulnerable, because they're flying into new situations all the time. So they have nothing to tell them what's safe in that habitat. Now, there are other peaks of mortality. There are peaks at the end of spring and early summer when local birds are fledging young. So those birds don't know where they're going. And you see peaks in winter as territorial birds flock up and start flying around. It turns out that windows near bird feeders are the most dangerous. They cause the most collisions. If you've got a bird feeder, don't play around with how far away it is from the house. Just make your windows bird friendly. You could do it by simply putting an insect screen on it. It doesn't have to be complicated. But birds are attracted there, they need the resource, and then they're gonna fly into your window. So again, birds flying in an uncluttered environment are often flying towards blue sky or haze like this, clouds, with no signal to tell them that they're gonna run into something. And they're not expecting to have anything in front of them. There's some wonderful papers by a guy named Graham Martin in Britain, who's spent his life looking at the visual ecology of birds. And he's one of my heroes, but you know, he really made me understand this. Now, obviously, if a bird is flying along and sees a tree, it's gonna change direction. And that is what we do to cause birds to avoid glass. We put patterns on the glass that they interpret, you know, something two-dimensional, as a habitat that they can't fly through. The work that people have been doing recently, flying birds through obstacle courses, has shown, first of all, that birds have a very precise idea of their wingspan. So if you fly them at ever decreasing width gaps, they'll keep flying normally until that gap is only 6% larger than their wings. And at that point, you can tell where they decide they have to change what they're doing, and they either raise their wings up or they clamp them to their sides. It's really phenomenal. And they've been doing this with vertical obstacle courses and with horizontal obstacle courses. And the birds use different mechanisms for those two things. So there's a lot of asymmetry in this system. But we know, I mean, all of you are birders, you know birds fly into trees all the time. They zip into small, dark spaces. Glass can actually look like a small, dark space, which is a danger that we don't usually even think about. So this is my model of a bird in flight. Actually, it's a kid texting on a skateboard, but this is the best I've been able to do in terms of photography. Not looking where you're going, your attention is focused in a different direction, you're zooming along, and then suddenly there's something in front of you. It's like driving down the highway and suddenly there's a deer in the middle of the road. So we have to have signals that are strong enough to take these birds' attention from the side and the back and focus it straight forward. That's how you stop collisions. And that's why it's not something that you can do without you being able to see it. The first person to really articulate that the measurements that we've found through research to stop bird collisions was an architect. Dan Clem did some studies in the 1990s using grids of tape on glass, and he was the first to say that most birds won't fly through a vertical gap that's 4 inches or less, and you can see why. Most birds won't fly through a horizontal gap, and you see why it has to be narrower, 2 inches, although this won't work for hummingbirds. This has been confirmed by other people doing other kinds of studies. And it's supported by this idea that birds know exactly how big their bodies are. They can zip through all kinds of habitat gaps, and so you have to say there's no gap here that you can fly through, basically. And here's the exception that proves the rule. This is a barn swallow flying vertically through a 1/2-inch gap between 2 barn doors. You almost never see barn swallows or any kind of swallow on lists of birds that collide with buildings. I think one reason for this is, I mean, this is complete speculation on my part, but I think if you're a bird and you're starting to approach a piece of glass and you don't know that it's a solid surface, you may start getting blowback, you may feel wind, and if you're a swallow, you're agile enough to take off, to turn. But most birds can't turn that fast because they're too close, if they actually perceive such a thing. They've been doing studies on birds avoiding aircraft, and some of these sound sort of ridiculous. They put lights on a Jeep so that it mimics an airplane, and they drive the Jeep towards a cage of cowbirds that are being videotaped. But they can see from the video exactly at what distance the cowbirds notice that something's coming. And they can also see how long it takes for those cowbirds to then react, to try to move out of the way. And it takes them too long to react. They can't do it because the Jeep or airplane is moving so fast. And that's one of the reasons you get collisions with airplanes, because even when the birds notice it, it takes them too long to get out of the way. So they're now working on trying to make airplanes visible from longer distances. So solutions, if to be effective, patterns have to be visible. I mentioned this earlier. A reflection completely can obliterate the view of a pattern that you're putting on a window to deter a bird. So, I mean, the first thing to notice is there's a window screen on that window, and it pretty much does away with the reflection. Window screens are really good solutions. People think, oh, this is complicated, we have to do something fancy, but window screens work really well. On that second window, there's black stripes of tape on the outside and on the inside. I mean, you'll notice you cannot see the stripes on the inside, really. You can see one of them, maybe. Same window 5 minutes later, white stripes on the inside and the outside. White reflects, obviously, more than black does. The inside stripes are fairly visible. The outside stripes are very visible. If you want to do something on the inside of your windows, you have to test it. You have to put something on your window and then go outside at lots of different times of day to see if it's worth proceeding with that. With some windows it can be, with some windows there's really nothing you can do on the inside. This is unfortunate because when we're trying to get glass manufacturers to produce bird-friendly materials, they don't like to put patterns on surface 1. You see it a lot more commonly in Europe and Asia. They are starting now, mostly because of bird collisions. They're starting to be willing to warranty glass that has a pattern on the outside surface. But that is only very recently that that's true. And your pattern can't be too delicate. This is 2 versions of the same set of lines. They get wider as you go from left to right, and from one side to the next, it goes from 20% density to 100% density. So it's pretty obvious. The wider and the more opaque the line is, the more it shows up. Those lines show up much less well against the reflection of a tree than they do against the sky. So if you want to make a delicate little pattern with narrow little lines, it may not work at all, because even though it's visible, it doesn't stand out enough to be a signal to a bird. So the good news, at least for me, I live in a neighborhood that has a lot of bird-friendly homes. Many of the homes have these small pane mullioned windows and window screens on most of the other ones. So as long as they don't decide to replace those with large picture windows, they're probably in pretty good shape most of the time. Now, obviously this does not hold for most of Southern California, for example. There are different architectural styles in different places, and some of them are more and some less dangerous for birds. But there are getting to be more and more materials that you can use to make your windows bird-friendly and are not necessarily like really terrible looking. So this is a window film that we actually put together as a prototype on the top left. That's the Bear Country exhibit at the Philadelphia Zoo. And we knew from some other work that this horizontal line pattern was actually very effective at deterring birds. We got it made up as a window film. We put it up on those windows, and they went from having multiple collisions every day to not having any collisions at all. But to them, the most important thing was that their visitors were not complaining that they couldn't see the bears. So this seems to be quite acceptable visually to a lot of people. We've put a lot of it up at the Bronx Zoo. That's the building I was talking about during the monitoring. And we put a gray version of that same film. Both of those have been up since about sometime in 2009, and they've pretty much gotten rid of the problem. So this is stuff you can actually now get on Amazon. The company that did the prototype for us decided to go into business, and they're marketing it. So this is good. You can get a closer view of it there. That's a handrail in one of the Bronx Zoo exhibits, but it gives you a good look at it. And the other one, Temple University had a bird-friendly materials design contest, and that was the winning design. They produced that and they put it on some of their bad windows, and it did well. So this is something that's relatively neutral visually. That works pretty well. This is another retrofit material. This was one of the early ones that was used in Canada, and there are a number of mirrored high-rise buildings that have a lot of this on it. This is a picture of the Concilium Towers, the subject of a major lawsuit in Canada. In Canada, the court agreed that reflections of buildings, off buildings, could count as an emitted pollutant, and that if your building killed birds, you fell under their EPA laws. If only that would happen here. Although there's some issue about how this is ever going to get enforced. But this feather-friendly material goes up like a window film, but then you pull off the backing, and it comes in dots and it comes in stripes. You can have your logo instead of dots. I mean, there's a million different ways that can be done. Nowadays, because all of this design is computerized, it's relatively easy to come up with your very own design for a bird-friendly window. But this is starting to be seen in the US as well. The Penn Vet School just put a bunch of it up on one of their buildings that was killing a lot of birds. This is Kaleidoscape. That is a name coined for a 3M product called perforated Scotch Cal. And you might know it as bus wrap. If you've ever been on a bus that has advertising on it, or if you've been on a shuttle bus from an airport parking lot, most of those vans have advertising on the outside. You can see out from the inside. It's perforated. You can put this on your windows. And the National Conservation Training Center put this up on a lot of their windows. That top view, you can see that they've put it up on the right-hand side, but not on the left. So it does obscure the view somewhat. Probably somewhat more than a window screen would. But it's very durable, and basically it's like painting your windows white. So it's extremely effective. I have had a tendency to think, well, who the heck is ever going to put that up? And it turned out that there's some of these solutions that aren't for me are exactly what other people are looking for. So Cape May Community College, in those two shots on the right, had windows that had no solar coatings. They were getting, it was in Cape May, they were getting dozens of dead birds every day, to the point where people didn't want to be in that building. And they decided to use Kaleidoscape, and they put it up on every window, every piece of glass on that building. That is only half installed up there on the top right. And it's reduced their heating and cooling costs a lot. It stopped the glare on the inside, which was keeping students from actually using some of the space. And on top of that, it stopped the bird collisions. So they're absolutely thrilled with it. And it doesn't look, it looks fine. Decals are probably the most familiar solution for collisions. And in general, people think they can put one up and then they're disappointed when that doesn't work. If you just put up one decal, a bird interprets it as something it can fly around. You have to use enough decals, again, to make that kind of spacing that birds think they can't fly through. There was an old piece of research by Konrad Lorenz that was briefly interpreted as meaning that birds might avoid what they think of as the silhouette of a raptor. This turns out not to be true. You might as well have a square as a silhouette of a hawk. But there's a wonderful article that somebody wrote tracing that meme as people debunked it, and the debunking has never really gone into popular consciousness. People keep thinking, oh, we'll put up a raptor decal. In the top center, that's the National Zoo. They've somewhat overdone it because they've got so many decals up that you can hardly see the animals through the glass, but that's good. The three sort of on the right, those are different ways that people have put up bird tape. The Virginia Zoo has a contest every year, and local architects, whoever wins, cut out their designs like a mosaic out of bird tape and put it up. So that's what that giraffe is. So there are a lot of ways that you can get people involved in this kind of stuff. Yeah, I'm sorry. Bird tape is a product that ABC created to fill a niche in the market, something that was like relatively cheap and quick to put up. But you can use any tape. You really can. You can use chart tape. You can use adhesive tape. The thing about bird tape is that it's a type of tape that's intended to go on the outside of glass and last for 5 years. But I've used chart tape on some of my windows at home, and that's lasted 1.5 years. So, you can really make up your own version of some of these things. That actually is my external motorized solar shade. You can put a shade on the outside of your windows. I got that on sale at Costco. It has a solar motor, and I run it from inside the house with a little remote. So if you've got a big picture window and you're really, really reluctant to put something on it, you can use one of these. And when you're there, you can look through your window, and when you're not there, you can close it. So all the time that you're not there, the glass will be safe for birds. So there are solutions if you look for them. One of my absolute favorites is the one on the right. We got a couple of long, emphatic messages through our web contact from a guy named Mr. Kaluza. He says, why, it's so easy to be bird friendly. Why don't people do this? So I asked him what he did, and he sent me these photographs. He takes a piece of deer fence, and he threads a rod through one end of it, and he throws the rod into the rain gutter above his window. So it takes no time, it costs almost nothing, and if you're 50 feet away, you can't even see that it's there. So there's lots of simple solutions that people are coming up with that work quite well. It doesn't have to be fussy. This is something, there's a website out there, Acopian Bird Savers. This has been largely popularized by a guy named Jeff Acopian. But it's also called Zen Wind Curtains. Basically, it's hanging string every 4 inches. Parachute cord is something that works really well, but you can see on that's an Eco Lodge in Costa Rica. They've just used twine. And it's highly effective, it's very cost effective. Google has a big long wall of those things. If you are doing it in a place where nobody's going to come along and yank on those, they'll last for a long time and they're extremely effective. The person who put the left-hand ones in, came up with her own way of applying them. She made frames and put the strings in the frames so she can put them in and take them out if she wants to. And she didn't have to, nail anything into her house wall. And this is a sort of a grab bag of other things. I'm a big fan of tempera paint. You can get a quart of it, for 99 cents. It's completely non-toxic. You can put it up freehand, like that second from the left at the bottom. You can use a template, like the one up at the top. That window is near my house, and I think they put some kid sticker collection up on it. Works fine. Different kinds of architecture. In the Bronx, you see a lot of storm doors that have ornate grills and things like that. Top left, there's bird tape on the window at the left. On the outside, on the window at the right, there's bird tape on the inside, and you cannot see it at any time of day. Those are my windows. And in the middle is something called an easy up window shade that you can stick up with suction cups. And they'll give them to you for oops, what happened? I've lost my microphone. Sorry. And I've gone back to the beginning of the presentation, which is really weird.
That's okay.
But we're almost done, so bear with me for 2 seconds. Anyway, there's lots of different ways that you can invent. The basic things that you need to remember are these dimensions. It has to be a gap. If you can make a window safe for a Maggie warbler, you can make a window that's pretty much safe for everything. Bigger birds, it works on just as well. So you don't need to worry about, are you trying to do something for a particular species? Luckily, even though there's a lot of interesting information out there about how different species view the world.
From current slide.
Oh, sorry. You don't really need to know any of that. What you need to know is the birds know how big they are, and they won't try to fly through a gap that's too small. Any way that you can come up to do that will work just fine. There's vertical white chart tape, there's horizontal black chart tape. All kinds of different things that you can do. Small structures can be as dangerous as big structures. I have a personal bus shelter, Jones. People have contacted me from about a dozen cities because birds hit bus shelters. We heard early on, about the hawks hitting the bus shelters on campus. It doesn't take a lot of glass to be a problem, and people are using glass in lots of new and different ways to make gazebos, wind walls, things like that. So one of the things we're trying to do is sort of discourage that. But I think this slide got in here just because I have this bus shelter thing. So that's it. Happy to answer questions. There are resources that you can find on ABC's website. On the left is our Home Solutions flyer. So a lot of the things that I was talking about just now, you can find there. You can go to birdsmartglass.org, which is part of ABC's website, and there are links there if you want to order some of the products that I've talked about. And bird-friendly building design. If you're interested in learning everything there is to know about collisions, you can download this as a PDF, or you can buy it in the bookshop. And you're welcome to contact me. If you are trying to pass legislation, if you're trying to fix a window on your house, I'm available to try to help you solve your problem. So don't hesitate to contact me. That's it. Questions?
In my case, it's usually been a robin attacking a window over and over again for weeks at a time.
Robins,
They are very persistent.
yes.
But I can see some more things to try, but I've tried a lot of things in the past.
Well, the question or the comment was about robins and cardinals and other birds, usually male, that will repeatedly attack their reflection in the glass. Luckily, they don't usually do themselves much damage, but this is territorial behavior. It's very distinct from what's happening here. Birds that collide are flying full speed head on into the glass. These guys tend to be jumping. And if you try to use some of the solutions that I've been talking about, they just think that that bird is behind, that set of stripes, and they'll keep on jumping. So if you want to stop them, you can put newspaper up over the glass, but you pretty much have to stop that bird from seeing its reflection. And they'll do this with car mirrors, and particularly if they're just demented about it, you probably want to stop them because it isn't good for them to spend their entire life attacking a piece of glass. Yeah?
So we have a question from the online audience wondering about your suggestions for educating architects or high-rise building managers to retrofit safe practices for migratory birds.
Well, this sounds very self-serving, but I have a continuing education class for architects that if they sit and listen to me for an hour, they get 1 hour of continuing education credit for both American Institute of Architects and for LEED. And this is something that actually motivates architects to come and listen to you talk. So I do a lot of these. I can do it as a webinar. I do it as a face-to-face when I'm in someplace or other. I do it a lot around New York. I do it in DC. And there are people that have trained with me that can also give this class. So we've got somebody in Portland that can do this. We've got somebody in the Twin Cities who can do this. I just trained somebody in New Hampshire who can do it. So they all have to get continuing education credit every year. We also try to go to conferences. So I just had a session accepted for the Green Building Council's annual convention next November. We try to get into the American Institute of Architects. They're a lot more resistant. Sustainable architects get it right away, that sustainable buildings shouldn't kill birds. Other people are less interested in listening to this story. And we're trying to reach them. It's one of the reasons that legislation is such a good tool. So you can point them towards resources. You're welcome to point them towards me. But the best way that we've come up with to try to get information to architects is through this continuing education process, because they need to have that. What's happening, though, is that the word is starting to spread through the architectural community, and I have been contacted on more and more numerous occasions by people in cities that have just heard about bird-friendly design and they want to incorporate it into a building that they're doing, which actually cheers me up considerably. When we did the first version of bird-friendly building design, all the buildings that we showed in it were examples of things, techniques that could make a building bird-friendly, but those buildings had not been designed for that. They'd been designed to control climate and things like that. In the new version of bird-friendly building design, we could use examples of buildings that were built on purpose for birds, and that was really exciting. There's a lot of activity on campuses, not just in the US, but in places like South Korea and in Latin America. Students are documenting collisions on buildings and they're remediating buildings. Vassar just built a new science complex that they insisted must get the LEED credit, that it was going to be a bird-friendly building. There's one going up at Smith. Who designed the Vietnam Memorial? Maya Lin. Maya Lin is the architect, and she's designed a bird-friendly library for Smith. So it's getting really exciting. Zoos are doing a lot with this because, of course, they're concerned about animals. And they're suddenly realizing that they have to deal with the operations of their grounds as well as the animals that are inside their buildings. So there's really starting to be a lot more interest in this. But architects are being trained all the time. One of the things I need to try to do is figure out how to get collisions into architectural school curricula. And I'm open to any suggestions. If you've got a route that you think might reach a lot of people, I'd be very happy to hear it. One of the things that seems to work well is towards the end of the year, a lot of local AIA chapters hold what they call Procrastinators Week for people who haven't gotten their continuing ed credits and have to sit through 6 sessions in one day. And we've been invited to be part of a couple of those. So even more interesting is that the people who seem to be most likely not to have gotten their continuing ed credits by the end of the year are the chief architects, the silverbacks. So it's a nice captive audience if we can arrange to do that.
Another question from online. Whether you're aware if there are any grants that can help educational institutions afford remediation, or any other tips about, those budgetary considerations?
If only there were. That's one reason I talk about trying to prioritize. I do know there was a foundation in Chicago that apparently donated money for the construction of the S.J. Quinney School of Law in Salt Lake City. And I don't know how that connection was ever made, but they made it possible for them to get a LEED Platinum building. They got a grant for most of the sustainability pieces of that building. But there's no obvious source of funding. You have to find somebody in the donor base of a particular school, or you have to run a bake sale. Sometimes some of the manufacturers are willing to donate material to get the publicity. But that is one of the sticking points for remediation, is that it always costs something. But you can do seasonal tempera. I mean, you can make a festival out of it. The spring migration is coming, and so we're going to put all this stuff up on the windows. I mean, one of the key things for all of this is to use it as an opportunity to educate people that see the building. So whatever you've done, it's going to call attention, or most of this stuff is going to call attention. So you want to have signage. There's a very nice visitor center in the Brooklyn Botanical Garden, and it was designed with a custom frit to be bird friendly, and they've got signage all over it that talks about the collision problem and why they've made the glass like this. And this is definitely something that schools should be doing all the time. But there's definitely a consciousness that is going through the academic community that this is part of sustainability. And there was somebody who did a master's thesis on it in Singapore. I mean, it is starting to be recognized around the world, which is wonderful. And then you think about all the buildings that there still are that we have to do something about. But we need more and more people to understand that this is a problem, and for them to realize that it's something that every individual person can probably do something about. I mean, unlike most conservation issues, which may make you depressed and maybe you can donate, some money, you can do something about your windows. This is conservation that you can do yourself. And this is a story that I've been working with a lot of zoos to tell. There are more people visiting zoos than go to professional sports events every year. So it's a very natural place to try to convey some of this information in an informal setting where people can actually then take it home, do something, and if we're lucky, they'll send me a selfie with their window. I can post it on Facebook. Bennett? All right?
I have this one last one from the online audience. So one person is curious whether anyone has used ultraviolet pens, and if you did those vertical designs, would that work?
Ultraviolet pens can work. You have to replace it a lot. So it's not really very appropriate for a large area of glass. It also has, there are a couple of different varieties of these out there, and they don't have a very strong signal. So they're certainly better than nothing, but you could do something with a magic marker that would be more effective. It would be more visible. But you got to remember again that there are a lot of bird species that hit glass that don't see ultraviolet. So a UV solution is really only a partial solution. But at the Bronx Zoo at one point, we were using red, green, and blue magic marker stripes, and it worked just fine. And it inspired the administration to give us enough money to do something that didn't look quite so silly. All right, well, thank you all for listening.